Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we are going to discuss with D. Raghunandan the issues regarding India's pledge on the climate change negotiations in Paris. Mr. Javadekar, the Environment Minister, has made certain documents, he's presented it. What are the fundamental issues in the climate change negotiations that are coming up? And does this document address them?
This is a position now of the Indian government. The cabinet has endorsed it. And I believe when the Prime Minister had gone and met President Obama, he must have got his green signal to release this. This is the pledge that the government India is making for the Paris Convention as India's contributions to the global emissions control targets, if you like, for reducing emissions in order to tackle climate change. The headline offer that India has placed on the table is that India would reduce its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% compared to 2005 levels by the year 2030. The rest of the document is really a fleshing out of this pledge that India has made.
But Raghu, the more important issue for Paris climate change negotiations is to really address the issue how much we need to cut emissions globally in order to save the climate.
Right.
Now, the whole purpose of this pledge and review was to reach a certain set of figures which could achieve this. Does a summary of all this pledge and review, at least by the biggies, which is already on the table, do they show a possibility of saving the climate?
Not at all. The target was to reach a level of emission reductions which would ensure that temperature rise does not go beyond 2 degrees Celsius. All calculations so far of all the pledges on the table, and India was the last of the big countries to make this pledge, shows that if these are the emission reductions which are being pledged, then we are likely looking at 3 to 3.5 degrees C rise in temperature, unless of course there's some very, very drastic cuts later after 2030 or 2035. The emissions gap are substantial. So from that point of view, this pledge by India is clearly not going to help, nor should one have expected that it would. After all, it's the onus on the developed countries to have met bulk of the emission reduction targets. The Europeans have probably come the closest by pledging a 40% reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2030. But the United States is shamefully behind that. They have only offered 23 to 26% below 2005 levels, which amounts to only about 8% below 1990 levels. That's shameful. It's no contribution whatsoever. And following the US example, Canada, Japan, Australia, which are the other big developed country emitters, have also made pathetic emission reduction targets. So in view of that, this 2 degrees C target is way beyond reach. And the so-called pledge and review system, there are only pledges now, and there is no sign of a review.
The United States and the developed world has probably something like 75 to 78% of the historical emissions, and even today the US is per capita the largest emitter. Yeah. Now, forget all these issues aside, what is the principle on which we look at reduction of emissions? That is not on the table at all.
Absolutely not. In fact, India, having accepted the pledge and review methodology, which is what the Americans had put forward at Copenhagen, which was bulldozed through the Copenhagen summit, but subsequently has found itself becoming from a de facto to a de jure position on the table and the negotiations. This is now the guiding principle. It is called common but differentiated responsibility only because the targets for developed countries may be different from the targets of developing countries. But the principle remains the same, which is each country voluntarily makes a pledge which it thinks it can do or which it can put on the table. But unless there is a mechanism, number one, as you say, there is a carbon budget. There is only so much carbon that the atmosphere can take. Therefore, the carbon in the atmosphere needs to be reduced by so much, or the emissions need to be reduced by so much. And this reduction, the burden sharing needs to be divided between the countries on the basis of equity and the common but differentiated responsibility. That principle has clearly been given the go by, and although India's document makes some platitudinous noises about climate justice and talks about India having low per capita, none of this has got built in to the mechanism by which this pledge is determined. Nor, and I think this is equally important, nor has India called into question the basis on which the pledges of the United States or Japan or other countries are. On what basis are those pledges? Do they meet the test of adequacy or not? There is, to my mind, a deep collusion at work here. And the idea seems to be, I will keep quiet about your emissions if you don't say anything too much about mine.
If I understand correctly, the Kyoto principles of differentiated responsibility, essentially common but differentiated responsibility, the differentiated is only now lip service. That basic part of it is given up. Every big emitter should reduce, cap, etc., etc. Second principle that's been also given up, which was all these were big issues in Copenhagen and in other climate change negotiations, the principle of equity. Per capita emissions was India's principle of equity, and we could also propose other ones, but nevertheless, this seems to be that people have rights, people have energy rights, people would have rights to global sinks in that case, and so on. So an equitable distribution of the bearing capacity of the globe, that would be a principle of equity. That seems to have been given up. So essentially, right now, there are no principles on which these emissions cuts are being offered. Is that correct?
Absolutely none. And that's the worst part of this exercise, that India, okay, one can argue, could we really have expected India to do this when nobody else is doing it? China is not doing it, Brazil is not doing it, no other big developing country is calling into question. Everybody has fallen in line with this American idea of pledge and review. So could we have expected India to do it? But my argument would be, India has been the champion of the per capita argument from day one.
No, Raghu, there's even a bigger issue. In terms of per capita energy consumption, yes, or per capita emissions, whichever way you look at it, particularly in terms of per capita energy consumption, India is actually an LDC. It's not even a so-called emerging economy, unlike Brazil, South Africa, which have relatively much higher levels of energy consumption. So India is lining up with the lower part of the developing countries would have actually made sense.
Absolutely. But then India has, for its geostrategic reasons, decided to go with the big boys. It wants to show that we are one with the big boys.
Big boys, or only one big boy?
The one United big States. Boy and the others who are gathering around them. This is a G20 game. Now, with none of the G20 countries today are raising the per capita argument. Everybody is happy to go along saying, I'll do my pledge, you do your pledge.
But only India really gains by per capita in the G20. Others may not gain too much, except Brazil, which is a very large hydroelectric and gas, therefore its per capita emissions are low.
And the forest.
And the forest.
The other aspect on this is, as you rightly pointed out, India is not only way down the list when it comes to per capita energy consumption or per capita emissions. India is also in the region which is among the worst affected by climate change. So it's not merely an existential problem for the islands who may drown, but it's also a major existential problem for India, climate change and its impacts. That doesn't seem to figure in the Indian document on the INDC either. And if the world is not going to meet the 2 degrees C target, I don't see India expressing its major concern and close to an existential threat that it would face. It's almost as if this is just a board game and you put a number on the table and I put a number on the table and we go back and celebrate.
Raghu, you talked about INDC as in the document. What does INDC mean?
The INDC is the acronym for Intended Nationally Determined Contribution to the overall emissions reduction which is going to be negotiated at Paris. Ironically, of course, the document which initially laid down that countries should formulate these INDCs, and the UN Framework Convention, the UNFCCC has spelled this out, called for a extensive dialogue in each country in order to formulate this, because this has implications for India's development. If you say we are going to reduce our emissions by so much, that means changes in India's domestic policy, the way we run our economy, etc. There should be a consultation, a wide consultation inside India, so that there is a buy-in by different segments. There has been none. This has been a completely top-down exercise conducted in secret by the ministry.
Though I don't see why you are calling it top-down. I thought it's top and top.
Top and
restricted
top.
To the
I mean, top-down in the sense it's top and being imposed on the rest. With nobody else having had any. So if you don't have a national determination behind this process, I wonder how this is going to get implemented at all.
Let me break some of the mystery for you, Raghu. There's also this talk about some astronomical sum of energy from nuclear, which is not going to happen.
Yes, that's
so
right.
That is going to be cool.
So the total was 40%, which they have said in this document, 40% of total electricity production would be from non-fossil fuel sources, which is hydro plus nuclear plus wind and solar. The nuclear is as high as 63,000 megawatts, and that's obviously nowhere near the horizon, although the government has been clever in putting in a rider saying provided we get fuel, which they know very well is not going to happen, or even if it does.
The fuel you will get.
Yes.
But essentially nuclear seems to be a dying technology in the world today, particularly after Fukushima.
Exactly. And you're not going to be able to afford it with all the risks that are involved. Hydro also is likely to be not a particularly promising thing. You seem to have exhausted most of our resources on that, except for a couple of pockets in the northeast, where again displacement issues are becoming major problems to be dealt with. So I don't see a very large scale expansion in hydro. So it's going to be relying on a shift from coal to wind and solar. Whether this is actually going to happen to the extent that this government has claimed or not, I don't know. But I am even more concerned by the fact that a country which has waxed eloquent, at least for so long, on the issue of equity between nations, and this document, although it doesn't translate in numbers, also talks about this a lot, has paid no attention to the question of equity of energy access within this country. If you are going to refurbish your development pathways and your energy utilization and your emissions, should you not be paying attention to, even if you generate all this electricity using solar or wind, who is going to get the energy? For what is it going to be used? Are you going to redress inequities in energy which are as huge today within this country as there are between the average Indian and the average American? There's virtually nothing in this document about that, either in terms of cooking energy, domestic energy, transport energy, housing energy, which would redress this energy inequity, which, by the way, today India has finally accepted as part of the sustainable development goals. And if you are going to actually address inequities in energy, I don't see that reflected in this document at all.
So Raghu, that's a discussion that we have to reserve for another day, because I think that's a very important one. It is how you want to develop itself and how energy should play a role.
That's right.
Particularly if it's going to be capital-led development, then is equity even remotely on the horizon?
Exactly.
We'll come back to you on these issues. Once again, thank you for being with us, particularly to address the run-up to the Paris negotiations, which will continue to engage NewsClick, and we'll be engaging with you on this issue.
Sure.
Thank you very much.